The mahogany doors of the Franklin County Courthouse slammed shut behind Emma Martinez as she clutched Buddy's leash with white-knuckled intensity. The morning sun filtered through the tall, arched windows of the historic building, casting long shadows across the marble floor. Emma's sneakers squeaked softly as she walked, her 10-year-old frame dwarfed by the immensity of the courthouse corridors. At just 10 years old, she had already endured more trauma than most adults ever would. The weight of it pressed down on her like a physical force, making each breath feel labored and difficult. Beside her, Buddy, a golden retriever with the softest, most intelligent eyes, moved with calm grace. His presence was like an anchor in a storm, grounding her when everything else felt like it was spinning out of control. 6 months earlier, on a cold February evening that Emma would never forget, something irreversible had happened. She'd witnessed her father's violent rampage, furniture destroyed, walls punched, threats screamed into the air with such raw fury that neighbors 2 houses away had called the police. Emma had hidden in the upstairs hallway, peering through the banister railings as her father's rage consumed the living room. She watched as he overturned the coffee table her mother had carefully selected from an antique shop. She heard the shattering of framed photographs, pictures of happier times that no longer existed. Most terrifying of all were his words. His voice, usually controlled and measured in public, became something monstrous and unrecognizable. He screamed threats that Emma didn't fully understand but knew were dangerous. The police had come that night, red and blue lights flashing across the white walls of their suburban home. Her mother had taken her away, rushing her to her grandmother's house with nothing but the clothes on their backs. And then something inside Emma had broken. She stopped speaking entirely, not because she physically couldn't, her vocal cords worked fine, but something in her mind had locked down like a vault, refusing to open. Selective mutism, the doctors called it, a psychological response to trauma so severe that her brain had decided words weren't safe anymore. They had tried therapy, multiple therapists, different approaches, various medications to ease the anxiety that accompanied her silence. Nothing worked. Emma could write, she could type on a computer, she could communicate in limited ways through gestures and drawing. But actual spoken words, they were trapped behind a wall that grew thicker with each passing day. Her therapist, Dr. Sarah, had been instrumental in suggesting Buddy. Emma's grandmother had researched extensively, spent months on waiting lists, and finally brought home this extraordinary golden retriever who had been trained specifically to work with children suffering from selective mutism and trauma. From the first day, it was as if Buddy understood Emma in a way no human could. He didn't push her to talk. He didn't make her feel broken or wrong. He simply existed beside her, a constant, loyal, non-judgmental presence. Through months of careful work, Emma and Buddy had developed an almost telepathic connection. They understood each other without words. Judge, a stern woman with 30 years of experience on the bench, had never allowed an animal in her courtroom before. Never. In 3 decades of presiding over cases, she had maintained strict decorum and followed every rule in the legal handbook to the letter. Animals were distractions. They were unpredictable. They had no place in the sanctuary of justice. But today was different. Today, Emma's entire future hung in the balance, and her grandmother had fought tooth and nail for this exception. She'd submitted letters from documentation from child psychologists, medical records, and personal testimony from Emma's school teachers about how dramatically the girl had deteriorated without her dog. The lawyers had argued back and forth for weeks. In the end, Judge had reluctantly agreed, but only because the alternative was having a traumatized child testify without any support system whatsoever. Emma's father wanted custody back. Daniel Martinez, a successful business consultant with a charming smile and an expensive suit, had filed a petition claiming that Emma's current living situation with her grandmother was harmful. He argued that the girl was being manipulated, that she was receiving unnecessary psychiatric treatment, that she simply needed to be back with her father in a stable home environment. He painted a picture of himself as a loving parent who had made a mistake in a moment of weakness, but had since learned from it and moved forward. His attorney was skilled, experienced, and had successfully defended clients in custody cases for 20 years. Judge had to decide if it was safe to return Emma to her father's custody, if it was safe for this traumatized child to return to the man who had caused her trauma in the first place. The stakes couldn't have been higher. As they entered the courtroom through the side entrance reserved for witnesses and vulnerable parties, Emma felt her heart racing in her chest. The room was exactly as she'd seen it during her visit with Doctor the day before. High ceilings, wood paneling, rows of seats, and at the front, the judge's bench elevated like a throne. There were already several people seated. Emma's grandmother in the gallery, looking worried and determined. Her father and his attorney at the defense table, looking confident. The court-appointed advocate for Emma, the judge's clerk and bailiff, and a few other officials she didn't recognize. All these strangers were here to decide her future. Emma felt Buddy's steady presence beside her. She wasn't alone. She never would be alone. The thought provided a small measure of comfort. She reached down and gently touched Buddy's soft golden fur, and she felt him lean slightly against her leg. It was a gesture of solidarity, of understanding, of unconditional support. Emma took a deep breath and walked forward into the courtroom. Her grandmother caught her eye and nodded encouragingly, though her face was etched with worry. Emma wanted to smile back, to give some sign that she was okay, but her face felt frozen. Judge looked down from her elevated bench and studied the small girl with the golden dog. There was something in her expression that softened slightly, a recognition of the weight this child was carrying. "Let the record show," she said formally, "that the protective animal has been admitted to the courtroom per special arrangement." She looked directly at Emma. "Hello, Emma. I'm Judge. I know this must be very scary, and I want you to know that you're safe here. Buddy can stay right beside you the entire time." "Do you understand?" Emma nodded, unable to speak even to answer this simple question. The judge sighed, a sound that carried the weight of experience and empathy. She'd presided over countless custody cases, but something about this one felt different. Something about the small girl and her golden dog suggested that today, the truth would need to find an extraordinary way to be heard. The bailiff called the court to order. The hearing was beginning. Emma felt Buddy press against her leg, and she held onto his leash like it was the only solid thing in a world that was crumbling around her. Whatever was going to happen next would change everything. She could feel it in her bones. Emma sat in the witness box, her voice still locked behind walls of fear that seemed to grow higher with each passing moment. The wooden seat was slightly too tall for her, causing her feet to dangle several inches above the floor. She looked almost comically small in the oversized chair, like a child playing dress-up in an adult's world. Buddy had been allowed to sit directly beside the witness box, his presence a lifeline she clung to desperately. Emma's small hand rested on his head, her fingers buried in his soft golden fur. She could feel his steady heartbeat, a reminder that at least one living being in this room understood her completely. The courtroom was now fuller than before. Word had spread through the courthouse hallways about the unusual case, a young girl who couldn't speak, a therapy dog, a custody battle that had become something of a spectacle. Several court employees lingered in the back, and Emma noticed a few people in the gallery whom she didn't recognize. Their presence made everything feel more real, more terrifying. This wasn't just a private family matter anymore. This was becoming public. Her shame, her trauma, her inability to speak, all of it was on display for strangers to see and judge. Dr. Sarah, Emma's therapist, took the stand first. She was a woman in her mid-50s with kind eyes and graying hair pulled back in a neat bun. She'd been working with Emma for 4 months, meeting with her twice a week, developing coping strategies and working to understand the depths of her trauma. Doctor was composed and professional as she was sworn in, but Emma could see the concern in her expression. She knew what was at stake. She knew how much this mattered. The prosecutor, a woman named Foster who worked for the district attorney's office, began asking Doctor carefully crafted questions. "Doctor, can you describe the condition known as selective mutism and what causes it?" Doctor leaned forward slightly, her voice clear and authoritative. Selective mutism is a psychological condition where an individual, typically a child, is unable to speak in certain social situations despite being physically capable of speech. It's not a choice or a behavioral problem. It's a manifestation of severe anxiety. It's often triggered by traumatic experiences or chronic stress. The individual's brain essentially decides that speech isn't safe in that environment and shuts down the ability to communicate verbally as a form of protection. She went on to describe Emma's specific case. Emma has experienced significant trauma. 6 months ago, she witnessed an incident involving violence and threatening behavior. Following that incident, she developed selective mutism. She can speak to her grandmother in private settings, usually only when she feels completely safe, but in most situations, including at school and in public, she cannot produce words. It's not refusal, it's genuine inability. Her anxiety levels are extremely high, and her brain has locked down verbal communication as a coping mechanism. Foster continued her questioning. Has Emma made progress in your therapy sessions? Doctor nodded. Some. With the introduction of her therapy dog, Buddy, we've seen modest improvements. She's able to communicate through writing, drawing, and through her connection with Buddy. But these are significant emotional challenges that will take considerable time to heal. Then the prosecutor asked the most crucial question. In your professional opinion, would it be beneficial for Emma to be returned to her father's custody at this time? Doctor didn't hesitate. No, absolutely not. Emma needs stability, safety, and a trauma-informed environment. She needs consistent support from people who understand her condition and who won't pressure her to just talk or get over it. Returning her to the source of her trauma would be detrimental to her recovery and could cause significant psychological harm. Emma watched as her father's attorney stood up for cross-examination. His name was Richard, and he was tall, well-dressed, and had the kind of confidence that came from winning cases. He smiled as he approached the witness stand, a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Doctor, how many children would you say develop selective mutism? Doctor answered carefully. It's relatively rare. Estimates suggest less than 1% of the general population experiences it. And continued, isn't it true that children often develop various behavioral issues following parental conflict? Isn't it possible that Emma's mutism is exaggerated or even encouraged by her grandmother, who has custody and perhaps benefits from painting Mr. Martinez in a negative light? Doctor's jaw tightened. Children do sometimes react to parental conflict, but selective mutism is a documented psychological condition. And I would strongly dispute any suggestion that it's being encouraged. No parent would intentionally encourage their child to be unable to communicate. That would be cruel and harmful. Pressed further, isn't it also true that therapy dogs are sometimes used as a crutch, preventing children from developing genuine coping mechanisms? Couldn't this dog actually be preventing Emma from learning to manage her anxiety independently? Doctor shook her head firmly. No, therapy dogs are an evidence-based intervention. They've been shown to reduce anxiety, provide emotional regulation, and actually facilitate therapeutic progress. Buddy isn't preventing Emma from healing, he's enabling it. But despite Doctor's powerful testimony, Emma could sense the doubt creeping into the courtroom. She watched as several people in the gallery exchanged glances. She saw Judge's expression become more guarded, more neutral. The attorney had planted seeds of skepticism, and they were taking root. Then came the next witness, Emma's school counselor, He about the dramatic behavioral change he'd observed in Emma. Before the incident in February, Emma was a happy, outgoing fourth grader. She participated in class, had friends, was doing well academically. After February, she became withdrawn, quiet, anxious. She would sit alone at lunch. She stopped raising her hand in class. She would have anxiety attacks in the hallway between classes. It was like watching someone's light switch off. But again, when cross-examined him, he raised questions. Isn't it possible that Emma's difficulties are related to normal childhood adjustment? Isn't it also possible that, given her mother's death 3 years ago, she might be experiencing normal grief that's being misinterpreted as trauma? Mister didn't have a strong answer to that. He wasn't a psychologist. He was a school counselor doing his best to help a student in crisis. Emma's heart sank. Her father sat at his table looking relaxed and confident. He had hired the best attorney money could buy, and that attorney was very, very good at creating doubt. When it came time for Daniel Martinez himself to testify, he took the stand looking disheveled and regretful. He wore a carefully chosen outfit, not his usual expensive suits but a modest button-down shirt and slacks. He'd been coached. Emma was certain of it. "I made a mistake," he said, his voice thick with emotion that Emma recognized as false. "I was going through a difficult time. I had some anger management issues that I've since addressed. I've seen a therapist. I've worked on myself. I love my daughter more than anything, and I just want her home where she belongs. I don't understand why my mistake 6 months ago means I lose custody of my only child. I'm a good father. Emma knows that. We have a good relationship." Emma's hands started shaking as she listened to him rewrite reality. The living room hadn't just been messy, it had been destroyed. His words hadn't been angry, they'd been terrifying. And their relationship hadn't been good, it had been complicated and sometimes frightening. But here he was, painting himself as a reformed man who'd made a small mistake. His attorney had done an excellent job. He'd raised just enough doubt, suggested just enough alternative explanations, and painted his client as sympathetic but also slightly victimized. The narrative was shifting. Emma could feel it. Judge's expression grew increasingly troubled as the day wore on. She wasn't convinced of his innocence. Emma could see that, but she looked uncertain. Doubt was creeping in, growing larger with each testimony. Emma squeezed Buddy's fur so hard her knuckles turned white. This was going to be close. This was going to be terrifyingly, impossibly close. The afternoon light slanted through the courtroom windows at a sharper angle, indicating that hours had passed since the proceedings began. Emma felt exhausted in a way that went beyond physical tiredness. It was a bone-deep weariness that came from holding back tears, containing fear, and listening to her father systematically dismantle the truth of what had happened. She'd watched as he sat on that witness stand and lied. Not obvious lies that everyone could see through, but subtle, strategic untruths that were so carefully woven into half-truths and omissions that they sounded almost believable. The courtroom seemed to be accepting his version of events. Emma could see it in the way some of the gallery members nodded. She could hear it in the tone of Judge's questions, which had become less skeptical and more neutral, a dangerous shift that suggested the judge was considering both sides equally. But they weren't equal. One side was truth, and one side was calculated manipulation from a man who was very, very good at controlling narratives. Emma's grandmother sat rigidly in the gallery, her hands clasped so tightly together that her knuckles had turned white. Emma could see the worry etched into every line of her face. Her grandmother had fought so hard for this, had spent money she didn't have on legal fees, had taken time off work to be present. And it was all starting to feel like it might not be enough. The prosecutor, Foster, looked frustrated as well. Emma could tell that she knew the case was slipping away. The burden of proof was on her side, and despite the clear evidence of Emma's trauma, despite doctors' professional testimony, despite the school counselor's observations, the defense attorney had managed to introduce just enough reasonable doubt that a judge might feel obligated to consider both possibilities equally. In custody cases, the standard was best interests of the child. But when there was significant doubt about whether abuse had actually occurred, judges sometimes gave fathers the benefit of assuming reform and redemption. Emma felt panic rising in her throat like floodwater. The lies were winning. Her father was actually going to take her home. She could envision it with terrifying clarity, being forced to leave her grandmother's house, leaving Buddy behind, going back to that home where every shadow held a threat and every raised voice made her want to hide. The thought made her stomach clench violently. She felt bile rise in her throat and had to swallow hard to keep it down. Her breathing became shallow and rapid. She was having a panic attack right there in the witness box in front of everyone. Judge looked down with concern. "Emma, are you all right? Do you need a break?" Emma couldn't even nod. She just sat there, frozen, trembling, feeling like the walls of the courtroom were closing in on her. It was then that she looked down at Buddy. Buddy's brown eyes were fixed on her with complete attention. He didn't look away. He didn't get distracted by the sounds of the courtroom or the movements of the people around them. He was entirely focused on Emma, sensing her distress the way he always did. In the months that they'd been together, Emma and Buddy had developed something extraordinary, a nonverbal language that existed entirely between the two of them. It had started in Doctor's office during one of their early sessions. Emma had been sitting on the floor, completely unable to communicate, her anxiety at its peak. Doctor had suggested that Emma try to think of a way to communicate with Buddy using only touch and movement. What had emerged was a series of specific patterns that Emma would trace across Buddy's back and sides. Each pattern meant something different. A slow, gentle circular motion meant, "I feel safe." 3 quick taps meant, "I'm scared." A long, deliberate stroke from shoulder to hip meant, "Help me." Over months of practice, these patterns had become their secret language. Buddy had learned to respond to each one with specific behaviors, changes in his body language, different ways of repositioning himself, different levels of alertness. This moment, desperate and panicked, Emma found herself instinctively reaching for that language. Her trembling hand moved across Buddy's golden fur in a pattern they'd practiced hundreds of times in therapy sessions. It wasn't a traditional command that a trainer would recognize. It wasn't a standard service dog response that was formally documented anywhere. It was something deeper and more personal, a conversation between two beings who understood each other on a level that transcended words. The pattern Emma repeated was complex. It began with a slow, circular motion across Buddy's chest, a grounding technique meant to center them both. Then she moved to a series of deliberate touches down his right side, a pattern that in their private language meant something like, "See me, hear me, show them what I cannot say." Her fingers shook as she traced each movement with precision, pouring all of her desperation, all of her truth, all of her need into the gesture. No one else in the courtroom understood what it meant. No one else even noticed at first. The attorneys were gathering their papers, preparing for closing arguments. Judge was reviewing her notes. The court reporter was still transcribing. Emma's grandmother was lost in worried thoughts. The bailiff was checking his watch. All of them missed the profound moment happening in the witness box. But Buddy understood. Emma's heart pounded as she repeated the signal, each touch deliberate, each movement a prayer. She was asking her best friend to help her tell the truth in the only way she still could. She was asking him to make the people in this courtroom understand what her voice could not express. She was asking him to be the bridge between her silent world and theirs. Would he respond? Would anyone understand? Emma's eyes filled with tears as she waited, her hand still resting on Buddy's fur. There was a moment of absolute stillness, a suspended second where everything hung in the balance. Emma could hear her own heartbeat thundering in her ears. She could hear the clock on the courtroom wall ticking. She could hear the shuffle of papers and the whispered conversation between attorneys. And then Buddy's ears perked up. His entire body shifted into an attitude of alert attention. His muscles tensed beneath his fur. His breath deepened. It was as if some invisible switch had been flipped inside him, activating something primal and important. Buddy's head turned and his eyes, those intelligent, soulful brown eyes, locked onto Emma's father across the courtroom with an intensity that seemed to transcend the normal bounds of a dog's perception. Emma felt something shift inside herself as well. She'd made the signal, she'd asked for help, and Buddy had heard her. Now everything was about to change. The movement was so sudden, so deliberate, and so utterly unexpected that it cut through the ambient noise of the courtroom like a knife. His movements were fluid and purposeful as he walked directly toward the witness stand where Daniel Martinez sat. The dog's muscles rippled beneath his golden fur with each step. His head was held high, his posture erect in a way that seemed almost regal. He was no longer the gentle therapy dog sitting peacefully beside a traumatized child. He was something more, something primal and determined, operating on an instinct that seemed to transcend the boundaries of normal canine behavior. The entire courtroom gasped. For a moment, nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Nobody even seemed to breathe. It was as if everyone had simultaneously hit pause, frozen in disbelief at what they were witnessing. The attorneys stopped shuffling their papers. The court reporter's fingers went still above her keyboard. Judge's pen froze mid-sentence. Even the bailiff, trained to respond to disturbances, seemed momentarily paralyzed by the sheer unexpectedness of what was happening. Buddy reached the witness stand and placed his front paws firmly on the edge. His nails clicked against the polished wood, a sound that seemed to echo through the suddenly silent courtroom with supernatural loudness. The dog's back legs remained planted firmly on the ground, supporting his weight as he hoisted his upper body up onto the stand. His golden coat gleamed under the courtroom lights, appearing almost luminous in the afternoon sunshine streaming through the tall windows. And then, most extraordinarily, Buddy's eyes locked onto Daniel Martinez's face with an intensity that was both beautiful and terrifying. There was no aggression in Buddy's behavior. He hadn't been trained to attack or threaten. His tail wasn't raised in dominance. His teeth weren't bared in a snarl. His ears weren't pinned back in aggression. By all conventional measures, Buddy's posture remained calm and controlled, but there was something in his gaze, a recognition, an accusation, a truth-telling that went beyond normal animal behavior. His brown eyes seemed to bore directly into Daniel's soul, as if Buddy possessed some supernatural ability to see through flesh and bone, into the very core of who this man really was. Daniel Martinez's face went sheet-white. For the first time since the proceedings had begun, his carefully constructed mask of control and contrition shattered like glass dropped from a great height. His carefully rehearsed expressions of regret and reformed behavior vanished completely. What replaced them was raw, primal fear. His eyes went wide. His mouth opened and closed soundlessly, like a fish gasping for air. His hands gripped the edge of the witness stand so tightly that his knuckles turned white, mirroring the color that had drained from his face. "Get that dog away from me," he screamed, his voice hoarse and primal. The words tore from his throat with such violence that spittle flew from his lips. "Now, get it away from me, now." His chair fell backward with a deafening crash that echoed through the courtroom like a gunshot. He scrambled backward, knocking over a water glass that had been sitting on the witness stand. The glass fell to the floor and shattered, water spreading across the polished wood. Daniel's expensive suit jacket got caught on the arm of the chair as he tried to escape, and he yanked it free with such force that a button popped off and skittered across the floor. Security guards jumped to their feet immediately. Two large men in dark uniforms moved toward Buddy with their hands raised, unsure whether they were dealing with an aggressive dog or a traumatized man. Judge's pen froze completely mid-sentence. She leaned forward from her elevated bench, her sharp eyes wide with shock and something else, understanding, perhaps, or the dawning realization that something extraordinary was occurring. "Remove the dog, remove it now," Daniel shouted again, backing away from the witness stand so quickly that he nearly tripped over his own feet. "It's attacking me. The dog is attacking me." But it wasn't attacking. Buddy remained exactly where he was, his paws on the edge of the stand, his eyes still fixed on Daniel's face with that penetrating gaze. The bailiff approached Buddy carefully, his hands outstretched. "Easy, boy," he said softly. "Let's get you back to Emma, okay?" But before the bailiff could reach Buddy, Judge raised her hand with such authority that everyone in the courtroom froze mid-motion. Her voice, when she spoke, cut through the chaos like thunder. "Stop," she said simply. That single word, spoken with the weight of 30 years of judicial authority, halted everyone. The bailiff stopped. The security guards stopped. Daniel, who had been continuing to back away, stopped. The entire courtroom seemed to hold its collective breath. Judge's eyes were fixed on Daniel Martinez, with an expression that Emma had never seen on any adult's face before. It was the expression of someone who had just witnessed something that had fundamentally altered their understanding of a situation. It was the expression of someone who knew, with absolute certainty, that they had almost made a terrible mistake. "I see," the judge said slowly, her voice carrying a note of dawning comprehension. She looked down at Buddy, who remained perfectly still, perfectly calm, perfectly certain on the edge of the witness stand. Then she looked back at Daniel, whose face had transformed from white to a sickly grayish color. His chest was heaving with rapid, panicked breaths. Sweat was beading on his forehead and upper lip. This wasn't the measured, controlled response of an innocent man startled by a dog's unexpected behavior. This was the primal, visceral terror of someone confronted with something they couldn't manipulate or control or charm with lies. Emma watched from her seat in the witness box, her hand still extended in the signal position, tears streaming down her face. She had done it. She and Buddy had done it. They had breached the wall of lies with something so powerful and so undeniable that no attorney could argue against it. No testimony could contradict it. No clever cross-examination could diminish it. Judge leaned back in her chair, her expression becoming more thoughtful, more concerned. She looked directly at Emma, then back at Daniel, then at Buddy. Her jaw tightened. "We are going to take a 30-minute recess," she announced, her voice formal but tinged with something darker. "During this time, I am ordering an immediate investigation into Mr. Martinez's background and history. Court security will remain present to ensure order." She looked directly at Daniel. "You will remain in this courtroom. You are not to leave, and you are not to have any communication with anyone without your attorney present. Do you understand?" Daniel nodded mutely, his face ashen, his confidence completely shattered. As the bailiff finally led Buddy away from the witness stand, gently and carefully treating him almost reverently, the dog's eyes never left Daniel's face until the last possible moment. It was as if Buddy was delivering one final message: "I see you. I know what you are, and the truth will come out." The courtroom erupted into shocked whispers and frantic activity as Judge left the bench. Everyone was talking at once, trying to make sense of what they had just witnessed. Something extraordinary had occurred, something that explanation and yet explained everything. Emma's grandmother rushed to her granddaughter's side, pulling her into a fierce embrace. Emma buried her face in her grandmother's chest, finally allowing the sobs she'd been holding back to pour out. Buddy was brought back to Emma, and the girl wrapped her arms around him, her small body shaking with the release of 6 months of terror and fear. Judge disappeared into her chambers, but not before giving Buddy one last long look, a look that seemed to contain recognition, respect, and a promise that things were about to change. The judge's chambers were located on the 3rd floor of the Franklin County Courthouse, accessible only through a private corridor that few people ever traversed. Judge sat behind her mahogany desk, her hands folded in front of her expression unreadable. The recess had been called 30 minutes ago, but she had used that time to think, to reflect, and to examine something she had seen in a man's face that she could not ignore. In her 30 years of judicial service, Judge had presided over hundreds of cases. She had seen criminals try to hide their guilt behind elaborate lies. She had seen innocent people struggle to defend themselves against false accusations. She had developed an almost instinctive ability to read people, to sense when something didn't add up, when the pieces of a story didn't quite fit together. But this, what she had witnessed in the courtroom just moments ago, was something she had never seen before. It wasn't just Daniel's fear. Many guilty people feared being caught. It wasn't just his loss of control. People under stress sometimes broke down. It was something deeper, something more primal. It was the reaction of someone confronted with something they couldn't manipulate, couldn't charm, couldn't rationalize away. It was the reaction of a predator confronted by a force that could see through all his masks and lies. And she had seen it before, she realized with a start, years ago. Judge turned to her computer and pulled up a case file from 14 years prior. Daniel Martinez had been arrested for assault when he was in his late 20s. A woman, his then-girlfriend, had pressed charges after an incident in which he'd become violently angry and physically aggressive. She'd suffered bruises, contusions, and emotional trauma. But then, mysteriously, she had dropped the charges. Daniel's attorney had successfully argued for the case to be sealed, claiming that the charges were being dropped due to a misunderstanding, and that maintaining the record would be unfairly prejudicial to his client. Judge had not presided over that case, but she remembered hearing about it in the courthouse hallways. She also remembered now that Daniel Martinez's mother worked in the courthouse as an administrative assistant. Money and connections. That was often how cases disappeared. But the case file still existed, and Judge was reading through it now with new eyes. The original complaint described a man who had become enraged over a minor issue, who had destroyed property, who had made threats, whose anger had been so sudden and so violent that the victim had feared for her life. The description was chillingly similar to what Emma had witnessed. Judge's phone rang. It was her clerk. "Your Honor, the investigators have completed the preliminary background check you requested. They're ready to present their findings whenever you're ready to hear them." "Send them in," Judge said quietly. Two investigators from the courthouse security office entered a few minutes later. They were seasoned professionals who had worked with the court system for years. They carried files, notebooks, and expressions of grim determination. "We found something concerning," the lead investigator detective said without preamble. "We looked into Daniel Martinez's background more thoroughly, and there's a pattern of violence that extends further than we initially discovered. 14 years ago, he was arrested for assault, but the charges were dropped when the victim declined to press forward. However, 6 months ago, around the time of the incident Emma described, he was involved in another custody dispute. This one was with his own sister over their mother's care and medical decisions." Judge leaned forward. "Tell me about that." "In that hearing, he had an outburst, similar to what happened in your courtroom today. He became verbally abusive, made threats toward court staff, and had to be removed from the proceedings. His sister was granted over their mother, and he was ordered to attend anger management counseling." The second investigator, a woman named Officer Sarah, continued the briefing. "We also obtained his medical records with proper authorization. He's been on and off various psychiatric medications over the years. There are notes in his file from a therapist indicating possible personality disorders and a history of manipulative behavior. The therapist wrote that he was charming and intelligent but lacked genuine empathy, and seemed to view relationships as power dynamics to be won or lost rather than genuine connections." Judge absorbed this information, her sense of alarm growing. "And his work history?" "Mixed," Officer said. "He's been successful as a business consultant, but there have been multiple complaints from colleagues about his behavior. Several women have reported uncomfortable interactions, inappropriate advances, and aggressive responses when rejected or when decisions didn't go his way. In one case, a female colleague reported that he threatened her career after she refused his advances. She was later fired under circumstances that seem questionable." Judge closed her eyes for a moment. The pattern was becoming clear. A man who could function in public, who could appear charming and successful, but who had a deep underlying problem with his ability to accept rejection or loss of control. A man for whom violence and intimidation were tools in his arsenal. "There's more," detective said, exchanging a glance with Officer. "We found something in the police report from the incident 6 months ago. Emma's mother called 911 the night before she died in the car accident. The call was placed at 2:47 in the morning. She reported a domestic dispute at her residence and requested police assistance. The responding officers found evidence of property damage and Emma hiding in an upstairs bedroom." Judge's blood ran cold. Why wasn't this information in the case file? "It was sealed along with Emma's mother's statement," detective explained. Her attorney at the time recommended sealing it, arguing that it could complicate custody arrangements and might traumatize Emma further if made public. Emma's grandmother may not have been aware of it. The papers are buried in files that aren't normally reviewed in a custody hearing unless someone specifically requests them. The judge sat back in her chair, her expression grave. So we have a man with a documented history of violence, a pattern of aggressive behavior in court settings, previous assault charges that were covered up, and an incident involving his own sister. And now he's seeking custody of a traumatized child who witnessed his violent behavior. That's correct, Your Honor, officer confirmed. And there's one more thing. We reached out to the woman who originally pressed charges 14 years ago. She wasn't eager to talk, but when we explained it involved a child, she agreed to speak with us. She said that Daniel had been increasingly controlling and aggressive throughout their relationship. She said he had threatened to hurt himself and her if she tried to leave. She said she dropped the charges because he convinced her it would be worse for her if she didn't, and because she was afraid of what he might do. Judge stood up and walked to the window of her chambers. From here, she could see the town of Franklin spread out below, the streets where Emma lived with her grandmother, the school where she'd once been a happy, talking child, the homes and lives that had been affected by one man's inability to control his rage and his need for power. She thought about Buddy. She thought about a dog who had somehow sensed something in Daniel that all the testimony and evidence and careful legal arguments hadn't been able to prove. A dog who had responded to a traumatized child's nonverbal plea for help with an action so extraordinary that it had pierced through all the lies and manipulation and careful construction of a reformed persona. In 20 minutes, the court would reconvene. In 20 minutes, Judge would have to make a decision, but she already knew what that decision would be. She had seen the truth on Daniel Martinez's face when he looked into a dog's eyes and realized that there was something in this world that could not be fooled, that could not be manipulated, that could see straight through to the darkness within. She turned back to the investigators. I want everything documented, every piece of this history. I want it all compiled into a comprehensive report, and I want it entered into the court record today. Mr. Martinez wanted to contest his daughter's account of events. Fine, but he's going to face every consequence of his history that the law allows. Detective nodded. We'll have it ready before court reconvenes. Judge returned to her desk and sat down heavily. She thought about Emma, sitting in that courtroom, unable to speak, but not silent. Never silent. Because she had found a way to speak through her dog, through her trauma, through the extraordinary bond between a girl and a dog who understood each other better than most humans ever could. Sometimes, Judge reflected, justice required more than laws and precedents and carefully constructed arguments. Sometimes it required the ability to recognize truth when it showed up in unexpected forms. Sometimes it required wisdom enough to listen, even when the speaker had no words. The courtroom doors reopened exactly 30 minutes after the recess had been called. The gallery was now even more crowded than before. Word had spread through the courthouse about the extraordinary incident with the dog, and courthouse employees, legal professionals, and curious onlookers had crowded into the room to witness the continuation of this unusual case. Judge took her seat on the bench with a gravity that hadn't been present before the recess. Her expression was set, determined, and radiating quiet anger. Daniel Martinez sat at the defense table next to his attorney, Richard, but something fundamental had shifted. Daniel's face was no longer the carefully composed mask of a reformed and sympathetic man. He looked haunted. His expensive suit was disheveled, his hair slightly mussed. A vein pulsed visibly in his temple. Sweat stains had appeared beneath the arms of his designer shirt. He kept glancing nervously at the area where Buddy had been sitting, as if afraid the dog might somehow reappear and repeat his extraordinary performance. Richard, however, looked confused and increasingly alarmed. He whispered urgently to his client, but Daniel seemed unable to focus on anything the attorney was saying. He stared straight ahead, his hands trembling slightly as they rested on the table. Judge called the court back into session, and the courtroom fell silent. "Before we proceed with closing arguments," the judge announced, her voice carrying an undertone of steel, "I have ordered an emergency investigation into Mr. Martinez's background and history. The results of that investigation have come to my attention, and they are deeply troubling. I am entering this information into the court record and reopening this hearing to allow for additional testimony and evidence." Richard stood up immediately. "Your Honor, I object. This is highly irregular. We haven't been given notice of these investigations and—" Judge raised her hand, silencing him. "You'll have your opportunity to respond, Counselor, but first, the court needs to hear what should have been heard from the beginning." Detective approached the witness stand, and over the next hour, he methodically laid out the pattern of violence and manipulation that characterized Daniel Martinez's life. He presented the sealed assault case from 14 years earlier. He presented the incident 6 months ago involving Daniel's sister. He presented complaints from workplace colleagues. He presented medical records documenting psychiatric treatment for anger management issues. He presented documentation of threats and controlling behavior from multiple women who had relationships with Daniel over the years. The courtroom grew increasingly silent as the picture emerged. This wasn't the sympathetic portrait of a man who had made one mistake and learned from it. This was the profile of a serial abuser, a man who used charm and intelligence as weapons, who viewed rejection as an attack on his authority, who responded to loss of control with violence and intimidation. But the most damaging evidence came from Emma's mother's journal. Officer presented it carefully, handling the leather-bound notebook as if it were sacred. She explained how investigators had found it in Emma's grandmother's safe deposit box, discovered during the emergency search that had been authorized by Judge. Emma's mother, Martinez, had meticulously documented her deteriorating relationship with Daniel. The entries spanned 3 years and chronicled a man who had gradually revealed his true nature, the controlling behavior masquerading as love, the jealousy disguised as care, the violence explained away as stress or temporary weakness. Officer read selected passages aloud, her voice steady but emotional. "He grabbed my wrist so hard it left bruises. When I asked him why, he said I had provoked him by questioning his business decisions. He said I was being disrespectful. He said I needed to learn to listen. He destroyed all of my photographs from before we met. He said he couldn't bear the thought of me with other men, even in pictures. He said it was proof of his love for me." Emma watched today as he threw the dining room chairs. She was so frightened. "I saw the fear in her eyes. I know I need to leave, but he's threatened to take her away from me if I ever try to divorce him. He said no judge would believe me. He said he'd convince everyone I was unstable. I'm trapped." But the most significant entry was dated just days before his fatal car accident. "He came home enraged today because a female colleague had been promoted instead of him. He said she must have seduced the boss. He said the world was full of women who used their bodies to get ahead." He looked at Emma while he said this, and something in his eyes terrified me more than his words ever could. "I called the police tonight. They came and took a report. He was furious when they left. He said I had humiliated him, that I had betrayed him, that I would regret this. I filed the report, but I'm not pressing charges. I'm too afraid of what he'll do. I just want to keep my daughter safe. I just want to protect her from him." The courtroom was completely silent as Officer finished reading. There were tears in the eyes of several gallery members. Emma's grandmother sat rigidly, her hand covering her mouth. Then came the final piece of evidence, the connection that made everything suddenly, horrifyingly clear. Martinez was killed in a single vehicle accident 3 days after filing that police report, Officer stated. The accident occurred at 3:47 in the afternoon on March 14th. According to police investigation at the time, she lost control of her vehicle on a highway curve and collided with a guardrail. The official determination was that mechanical failure caused the incident, specifically, that her brake lines had deteriorated. Officer paused, letting that sink in. However, when we reviewed the investigation file more carefully, we discovered something troubling. The mechanic who examined her vehicle after the accident noted in his report that the brake line corrosion seemed unusual for a relatively new vehicle. He documented his suspicion that the deterioration might have been accelerated by external factors, but he noted that without definitive proof of sabotage, he couldn't make an official determination. The case was closed as a mechanical failure, and the investigation was never reopened. Judge leaned forward, her expression grave. "Are you suggesting what I think you're suggesting, officer?" "I'm suggesting that Emma's mother may not have died of accidental mechanical failure," officer said carefully. "I'm suggesting that Martinez was possibly eliminated because she filed a report against her husband. I'm suggesting that a man who had already demonstrated a pattern of controlling and violent behavior may have taken the ultimate step to control a woman who was trying to escape." The courtroom erupted, gasps, murmurs. Richard jumped to his feet, shouting objections. Judge gavelled for order, and gradually the room quieted. Daniel Martinez had gone absolutely white. He looked as if he might vomit. His hands were shaking violently now, not from nervousness but from something deeper, possibly shock, possibly the realization that his carefully constructed lies were crumbling to dust. "These are serious allegations," Judge said quietly, her voice cutting through the remaining murmurs like a knife. "And they go beyond the scope of this custody hearing. However, they are highly relevant to the question of whether a child should be placed in this man's custody. Officer, are you prepared to turn this evidence over to the district attorney for potential criminal investigation?" "Yes, Your Honor," officer confirmed. "We believe there is sufficient evidence to warrant reopening the investigation into Martinez's death." Judge looked directly at Daniel. "I am suspending this custody hearing pending a criminal investigation. The court will reconvene in 2 weeks, at which time we will reassess the situation. In the interim, Mr. Martinez is to have no contact with his daughter. A protective order is being issued immediately. Furthermore, Mr. Martinez will be subject to electronic monitoring to ensure compliance with this order." Richard looked stunned. This had gone from a straightforward custody case to a potential murder investigation in the span of an afternoon. Emma sat in the witness box, her small hand buried in Buddy's fur. She didn't fully understand the legal implications of what she was hearing, but she understood one thing with absolute clarity. Her father's lies had been exposed. The truth that she had been unable to speak with her own voice had been spoken by her mother's written words, by investigators' findings, by a dog's extraordinary recognition of something dark and dangerous. The courtroom was dismissed. As Emma's grandmother rushed to collect her granddaughter, she looked directly at Judge and mouthed the words, "Thank you." Judge nodded slowly, her eyes fixed on Emma and Buddy. She had spent 30 years in the judicial system, had seen countless injustices slip through the cracks of bureaucracy and legal procedure. But today, truth had found a way through. Today, a child and a dog had forced the system to see what it had been too blind or too lazy to see before. Justice, real justice, was finally beginning. 2 weeks passed in a blur of legal activity and investigative frenzy. The district attorney's office, reinvigorated by the possibility of solving a 3-year-old case that had been closed prematurely, launched a comprehensive investigation into Martinez's death. Forensic specialists, the vehicle, independent mechanics were brought in to review the brake line deterioration. Financial records were subpoenaed. Cell phone records were analyzed. Text messages between Daniel and various associates were reviewed for incriminating evidence. In the courthouse, Judge reviewed file after file, document after document, each one adding another layer to the portrait of a man whose capacity for violence and control had apparently known no bounds. The investigation had revealed details that were almost too disturbing to contemplate. A man who had systematically isolated his wife from friends and family. A man who had controlled her finances and monitored her movements. A man who had threatened to take away her child if she ever attempted to leave. A man who, when confronted with the prospect of losing control, had possibly committed the ultimate act of violence. 3 days before the court was scheduled to reconvene, Daniel Martinez's attorney requested an emergency meeting with the district attorney and judge. The meeting took place in the judge's chambers, behind closed doors, away from the public eye. What transpired in that meeting would remain sealed until after the final judgment, but the results were immediately evident. When court reconvened on a gray Tuesday morning, the atmosphere in the courtroom was fundamentally different. There was a sense of closure, of finality, of truth having finally emerged victorious over lies. Daniel Martinez looked as if he had aged years in the intervening 2 weeks. His suit hung loosely on his frame. His face was gaunt and ashen. His eyes had taken on a haunted, desperate quality. Judge called the court to order, and before anyone could speak, she addressed the room with the gravity that only someone who had witnessed a profound miscarriage of justice could muster. This court has received significant new evidence regarding the death of Martinez, which occurred 3 years ago. This evidence suggests criminal negligence at minimum, and possibly more serious charges. The investigation is ongoing, and these matters will be addressed in the appropriate criminal venue. She paused, letting her eyes scan across the courtroom. However, today's proceeding is focused on the custody matter regarding Emma Martinez. Based on the evidence presented during the previous hearing, and the additional evidence gathered during the investigation that followed, this court has reached a clear determination. Judge looked directly at Daniel Martinez. Mr. Martinez, you have presented yourself to this court as a reformed individual who made a single mistake. The evidence shows that you have a documented history of violence, control, manipulation, and aggression spanning at least 14 years. You have misled this court. You have attempted to regain custody of your daughter through deception and the exploitation of legal procedures designed to protect the innocent. Daniel's attorney placed a restraining hand on his arm, as if warning him against any outburst. Furthermore, Judge continued, the evidence suggests that your daughter witnessed a violent incident that caused severe psychological trauma. Rather than seeking to help her heal, you sought to reclaim custody of her, which would have removed her from the safe, stable environment provided by her grandmother and exposed her again to the source of her trauma. The judge's voice became harder, more emphatic. This court will not allow that to happen. Not today, not ever. She turned to address the gallery. I want to be clear about something. This case has revealed systematic failures in our justice system. An assault case was sealed and forgotten. A restraining order request was because the request was filed incorrectly. Warning signs were missed because no one was looking carefully enough. A young girl suffered severe emotional trauma that could have been prevented, and a woman may have lost her life because the system failed to recognize the danger she was in. Judge looked down at Emma, who sat with her grandmother, Buddy, at her side. But this girl, through her own extraordinary courage and through the help of a remarkable animal who seems to possess wisdom beyond what we typically attribute to dogs, has forced this system to see what it should have seen all along. I commend her, I honor her, and I will do everything in my power to ensure that she is protected from here forward. She turned back to Daniel. Mr. Martinez, you are hereby stripped of all custodial rights to Emma Martinez, effective immediately and permanently. You are prohibited from any unsupervised contact with your daughter until she reaches the age of majority. You are further prohibited from any communication with her, direct or indirect, without the express written consent of her grandmother and the approval of this court. Any violation of these orders will result in immediate arrest and prosecution for contempt of court. Daniel started to speak, but his attorney grabbed his arm forcefully, silencing him. Furthermore, Judge continued, I am ordering you to submit to anger management therapy, psychological evaluation, and psychiatric treatment as deemed necessary by court-appointed professionals. You will submit to electronic monitoring for a period of 12 months. You will maintain employment and submit proof of such employment to the court on a monthly basis. You will pay child support to your daughter's legal guardian in the amount of $2,000 per month, which will be held in trust for Emma's future education and therapeutic needs. The judge paused, letting the weight of her ruling settle over the courtroom. Should you ever petition this court for modification of these custody arrangements, you will be required to provide evidence of genuine, sustained psychological reform. Superficial compliance will not be sufficient. Your pattern of behavior suggests deeply rooted issues that cannot be resolved through minimal effort or time alone. She looked at Emma's grandmother. Full legal and physical custody of Emma Martinez is awarded to her grandmother. Guardianship proceedings will be initiated to make this arrangement permanent and legally binding. This court recognizes Mrs.'s dedication to her granddaughters and her commitment to providing a safe, stable home environment. Emma's welfare is and will remain this court's primary concern. His hands flew to her mouth as tears streamed down her face. Emma, understanding the significance of what had just happened, buried her face in her grandmother's shoulder while Buddy pressed protectively against her side. Additionally, Judge continued, turning her attention to the gallery, I am issuing a formal recommendation to the district attorney that this case regarding Martinez's death be reopened and investigated with the utmost seriousness. If evidence supports charges against Mr. Martinez in connection with that death, those charges should be pursued to the fullest extent of the law. The courtroom erupted. Photographers, journalists, and onlookers who had been permitted to observe the proceedings began frantically taking notes and photos. The story of a traumatized girl and her therapeutic dog forcing the legal system to see truth had captured the imagination of the media and the public in ways that would echo far beyond this small courthouse. Daniel Martinez was led away by court security, his face a mask of desperation and rage. His carefully constructed world had collapsed completely. The lies that had protected him for so many years had been obliterated by a combination of legal investigation, historical records, a mother's journal, and a dog's inexplicable recognition of something dark and dangerous. As the courtroom cleared, Judge remained on her bench for several minutes, watching Emma with her grandmother and Buddy. The girl looked up, and for the first time since the proceedings had begun, there was something different in her expression. The paralyzing fear was gone. The trauma was still there. It would take time and continued therapy to fully heal from such deep wounds, but something essential had shifted. Emma's voice was still locked away, still not ready to emerge, but she was no longer alone in her silence. She had her grandmother. She had Buddy. She had a court system that had finally recognized the truth and acted to protect her. Judge understood something in that moment that she would carry with her for the rest of her career. Justice wasn't always delivered through precedent and procedure and carefully constructed legal arguments. Sometimes justice required the ability to recognize truth in unexpected places. Sometimes it required listening to voices that spoke without words. Sometimes it required the courage to overturn assumptions and dig deeper when something didn't feel right. And sometimes, justice required the intervention of a golden retriever who understood trauma and truth on a level that transcended the normal boundaries of human understanding. 6 months had passed since that extraordinary day in the courthouse, when Buddy had walked to the witness stand and changed everything. Emma sat in the small home office of Dr. Sarah, the late afternoon sun streaming through windows that overlooked a quiet neighborhood street. Buddy lay at her feet, his golden head resting on her shoe, his presence as constant and comforting as it had been from the very beginning of their journey together. But something was fundamentally different now. Something had shifted within Emma that no one could have predicted. She was speaking again. Not all the time, not in loud, confident sentences, but in small whispers, in quiet words shared with her grandmother and doctor, in fragments of sentences that emerged when she felt safe enough to let them. The selective mutism was slowly releasing its grip on her vocal cords and her mind. The words were coming back, word by word, sentence by sentence, paragraph by paragraph. "Tell me about school this week," Doctor said gently, her voice carrying the warmth and understanding that had become familiar to Emma over months of therapy. Emma took a deep breath. Buddy's ears perked up slightly, sensing her readiness to speak. I read aloud in English class," Emma whispered, her voice still carrying the tremor of someone unused to using her voice. "Just one paragraph, but I did it." Doctor's face broke into a genuine smile. "That's wonderful, Emma. That took tremendous courage. How did it feel?" Emma was quiet for a long moment, thinking about the question. "Scary," she finally said, "but also good, like I was telling the world I'm still here, that I'm still me." The transformation had been neither quick nor easy, but it had been real. Emma's therapist had explained to her grandmother that trauma recovery wasn't linear. There would be good days and difficult days. There would be progress and setbacks, but the fundamentals had changed. Emma now lived in a home where she felt safe. She now lived with a woman who loved her unconditionally. She now had a dog who seemed to understand her at a cellular level. And the source of her trauma was no longer a threatening presence in her life. 3 months earlier, criminal charges had been filed against Daniel Martinez in connection with Martinez's death. The investigation had revealed that he had taken his vehicle to a mechanic the day before his fatal accident, a mechanic he had deliberately chosen because they were not particularly careful about documentation. Evidence suggested he had paid the mechanic $15,000 in cash with instructions to adjust the brake system. The mechanic, when confronted with this evidence, had initially involvement but eventually confessed, accepting a deal in exchange for his testimony. The case against Daniel was circumstantial but compelling. He had motive, had filed a police report, and was planning to divorce him and take Emma away. He had the means and the opportunity to tamper with her vehicle. He had attempted to cover his tracks by hiding the cash payments through various financial transfers. Most damning of all, his pattern of violence and control provided a clear psychological profile consistent with someone capable of committing such an act. Daniel had pled guilty to involuntary manslaughter in exchange for a reduced sentence, though his attorney was still pursuing appeals. He was currently incarcerated in the state penitentiary, serving a sentence of 25 years to life. He would be eligible for parole consideration in 15 years, but judge had made it clear in her sentencing statement that she would oppose any parole request personally. The media coverage of the case had been extensive. Emma's story, the traumatized girl who couldn't speak, the extraordinary dog who had somehow communicated truth, the legal system forced to see what it had been missing, had captured the public imagination. News outlets from across the state and even the nation had covered the case. True crime podcasts had devoted entire episodes to analyzing what had happened. Legal scholars had written articles about the implications for custody law and the importance of recognizing patterns of abuse. But for Emma, all of that was background noise. What mattered was that she was safe. What mattered was that she was healing. What mattered was that she was slowly reclaiming her voice and her life. Her grandmother had made some changes to their home in the months following the judgment. She'd converted the upstairs bedroom into a comfortable space where Emma could retreat when she needed quiet and safety. She'd enrolled Emma in a specialized trauma-informed school where the teachers understood selective mutism and were trained to support students with complex emotional needs. She'd arranged for Buddy to receive official certification as an emotional support animal, which allowed the dog to accompany Emma to school and public spaces. Most importantly, her grandmother had made it clear to Emma, in words and actions every single day, that she was loved completely and unconditionally, that her trauma was not her fault, that her voice mattered, that she deserved to be heard and protected and cherished. "Your grandmother called me yesterday," doctor said during one of their sessions. "She told me that you sang while you were taking a shower. Just a few notes, but you were singing." Emma felt her face flush. She hadn't realized anyone had heard her. She'd been in the bathroom, steam rising from the hot water, feeling safe and hidden, and a melody had simply emerged from her throat. She'd been terrified at first, unsure if her voice would actually work. But it had. The notes had come out, tentative and soft, but real. "I did," Emma whispered. It felt good." "That's beautiful, Emma," doctor said. "That's your voice finding its way back. It doesn't have to be loud or confident. It just has to be yours." The court case regarding Emma's custody had become something of a landmark decision in family law. Judge's ruling was being cited in other custody cases across the state. Law schools were using it as an example of how judges should approach cases involving child trauma and parental abuse. The case of Martinez v. had become more than just a custody battle. It had become a statement about how the legal system should recognize and respond to domestic violence and child protection. And in the center of it all was Buddy. The golden retriever had become something of a local celebrity. Local news stations had done segments on the remarkable dog who had somehow communicated truth in a courtroom. Therapy dog organizations had reached out to Buddy's trainer, asking for details about his training and how he had come to possess such extraordinary instincts. A documentary filmmaker had approached Emma's grandmother about creating a film about Emma's story, emphasizing Buddy's extraordinary role in it. But Buddy remained, first and foremost, simply Emma's dog. He didn't know about his fame or the impact he'd had on the legal system. He just knew that his girl needed him, and he would be there for her every single day for as long as she needed him. Late one evening, Emma sat on the front porch of her grandmother's house with Buddy lying beside her. The autumn air was crisp and cool. The leaves were turning brilliant colors, oranges, reds, golds. The world felt new and alive in a way that Emma hadn't experienced in a very long time. She reached down and stroked Buddy's soft ears, and he lifted his head and licked her hand gently. "Thank you," she whispered to the dog, "for everything, for saving me." Buddy pressed his head against her leg, and in that simple gesture, Emma felt the full weight of unconditional love and complete understanding. She'd learned something profound through her journey, that sometimes the most important truths didn't need to be spoken in words. Sometimes they could be communicated through a gentle touch, a faithful presence, a willingness to stand beside someone in their darkest moment and refuse to abandon them. Emma's voice was returning slowly. Her trauma was healing gradually. Her trust in the world was being rebuilt carefully. But the bond between a girl and a dog who had changed the course of justice together would remain forever, unbreakable, unconditional, and absolutely real. In the darkness of that autumn evening, Emma finally allowed herself to smile. Not a small, uncertain smile, but a genuine expression of joy and gratitude and hope for the future. She had survived the unsurvivable. She had found her way back to herself. And she had discovered that even when her voice had been stolen by trauma, there was another way to speak the truth. Sometimes the greatest truth didn't require words at all.